Hi everyone, welcome to the first pre-recorded lecture for GloKnoCo, which is the Erasmus Plus funded project that Brighton University, Palaca University and Paderborn University are all collaborating with. Thank you very much for taking part and put yourselves forward. We genuinely think that this is a great opportunity to meet people from around the world, work with your colleagues in different universities, but equally also to work with NGOs, non-governmental organisations working in the area of sport for development and peace. So this project is pretty much around understanding sport for development and peace and giving students and partners an insight into how do universities work with those NGOs, but also giving you as students an opportunity to engage and work and think about a particular sector of sport that often gets overlooked. I'm going to be telling you a story about sport and thinking about why we should study sport, what the sociological implications of this are. I'm going to tell you a story about the formation of sport, what it means to people, and where it can go in various ways. And one of those parts will be about the sort of the growth and the globalization of sport and the economic transformation of sport in the last 40 years. And that has led to an explosion of job opportunities, in particular, often around the business side of sport or working within the sport science side. But there is also a growth over the last 20 years of people utilizing sport as a positive social activity, using it as an engagement tool to either bring people in and engage certain communities, or as a way of, as an activity in itself, and then using it to try to educate people from around the world. What you're going to find out throughout the rest of this particular project and these lectures and the sessions that we do, you're going to find more detailed aspects as the sector of sport for development and peace. You're going to hear from the NGOs and the project partners actually explaining what it is that they do and why they're doing it, and also some of the problems they face. So your individual projects will be tasked, or your group projects rather, will be tasked with addressing a particular issue for each of those NGOs. But also through the panelists and the panel discussions that we have at the end of each of the 4 weeks coming up, we'll be giving an insight into their opportunities, their world, their job, their sector, and hopefully it's going to give you the opportunity to work with people internationally. It's going to help you work with NGOs and help problem solving and organizational aspects around this particular sector, but also will give you a deeper understanding of this sector and whether it's something you might want to consider moving into after you've graduated. So I'm going to start with a very basic introduction to why should we study sport, the value of sport, how sport is used, why sport. I'm a sociologist. My name is Mark Doidge. I'm at the University of Brighton. My research is around both two things. One is around political activism in football fans, so how football fans address particular social issues, notably things like racism, tackling racism rather, but also other forms of marginalisation, but also how sport can be used as a tool to work with new migrants, refugees, and people working in or moving into new communities. So I'm going to be telling you a story that is going to go through from basically 2,000 years ago. Why do we study sport? What is interesting about sport? Through the purpose and meaning of sport and what it gives to people, and then give a very quick history about the role of sport and where it has come from and what that means. So really getting in, and hopefully what I'm going to do is be challenging some of your preconceptions about sport and highlighting what sport has been used for, particularly around certain athlete activism, but also some fan movements as well. And then talk at the end about how this leads into sport for development and peace and what role sport can play. And that hopefully will then sort of give you a grounding and a foundation for which we'll start thinking about the other activities that we'll be doing, and then leading into the much more focused lectures and group work around sport for development and peace and the sector. So what I'm going to ask you to do now is watch a video. So what I would like you to do is I'm going to share hopefully my screen will still be sharing, but go to YouTube and search for Gladiator Battle at the Colosseum. It's a 7-minute video. You don't have to watch the whole 7 minutes, but I think after 2 or 3 minutes, you'll get a sense of what's going on. What I'd like you to do is just pause this particular lecture, go and watch this video clip. And what I'd like you to do is just think about what this tells us about Roman society, okay? Have a think about it, have a reflect on it. Obviously, this is a dramatized movie. It's a movie. It's not necessarily absolutely historically accurate, but it does give us a flavor about what Roman society was like. So what I'd like you to do, pause, watch this video, and then come back, have a bit of reflect about what that tells us about Roman society, and then come back to the slides and what we'll be talking about. So hopefully you've all watched that video, or at least part of that video, and reflected on what that might do and what that might tell us about Roman society. Now, again, to reiterate, this is the dramatization. This is a movie, certain stylized imagery, which is for the 20th, 21st century. But it also does tell us quite a lot about Roman society. Because what I'm hoping that you'll have started to see just from those particular, that particular clip, which is grounded in history, is one, that gladiators were slaves. They weren't free to necessarily move on and to engage in their life in a particular way, but those that were successful were granted freedom at a later point in their life. However, those that made it to later points in their life, as you could probably tell from that quite gruesome clip, and I should have warned you, and apologies if it was a little bit too gruesome, was that many people actually died in the arena. And there's some famous artworks like this one that I've got up here that sort of illustrate how violent and gruesome that was. What you'll also see from that particular clip is the crowds there, the way the crowds were glorying and glorifying within that particular violent setup and that violent scenes. The population and the public were almost bloodthirsty in how they wanted the gladiators to operate, to entertain them by using violence. And what you'll also have seen is that there was and what you can see from this picture in particular, is also how different social classes were represented within the sporting arena. So within the particular clip that you'll have seen that there was a Roman emperor there who was putting on these spectacles for the people because it's what they wanted. And there was also senators there in white robes who were recognizing potentially that this is a place of power and a place of interest and an intrigue. And if this is what the public want, then this potentially is a way of gaining power or gaining influence. But what also was clear from that is almost how the public, that audience, potentially the power that was involved with this, is that certain gladiators could become celebrities. So almost we see an early form of celebrity culture where the best or the most entertaining of gladiators became public public celebrities, that people would chant their name, that they would be you know, sort of almost, people would turn up to watch them, and not too dissimilar to how we might see certain athletes and footballers today, for example. And the one point I would want to return back to is the violence. What we can tell from the history of gladiators, for example, is that it was violent. People would die in the arena. This was public spectacle. This was a public event. This is something that people went to watch, to enjoy, and they enjoyed the violence. They enjoyed people being killed. So one, obviously, it tells us a story of social class, that slaves could be put out there to fight and die, and people would be happy with that. As well as emperors putting on these events, or local patrons putting on these events. But it also told us about the violence of ancient Rome. It tells us a lot about how violence potentially was commonplace, an empire that was a constant war, and potentially also how these games were a mirror or a metaphor for war and the battles that had taken place in the past. So often the various styles of gladiators that were dressed, would be wearing particular helmets or use particular weapons in order to recreate the image of war, and an empire that was built on war, and its grandeur was built on conquest and subjugation of those who it conquered, and therefore in some cases turning them into slaves and then allowing them to, not allowing them, but making them fight in the arena. And if any of you have ever been to somewhere like Rome, for example, what you'll also notice is just the grandeur of the actual architecture and the location of it. So within Rome, for example, hopefully, I'm guessing you'll have all seen images of the Colosseum in Rome, which is where these events took place. But these, every town or important town would have had a Colosseum, an arena like this. But if you go to Rome, you'll notice that at one end, where the Colosseum is, right next to it is what's called the Forum, which was the economic hub of the ancient city of Rome. And then just at the other end of the Forum is the Capitoline Hills, which is sort of the political hub of the city. So what we see within ancient Rome is that gladiators, sport, spectacle was an integral part of the landscape of people's everyday life and about how they see things. So why is this important to sport today? Have a think about, as I'm speaking now, have a think about what activities are commonplace across every culture and across history and across the globe as we speak now. The obvious answer, one of them is sport, but there's not very many when we actually start to think about it. There's religion, there's family, there's clothing, there's food, there's music and dance, sex, and that's about it. So something that we can see that is so important to people on a daily basis, on a regular basis, such as sport, is something that has happened across human history and equally across all cultures. So what we can do is we can compare and contrast. So what we can do is, utilizing sport as a lens to understand society, we can look at how society operates by effectively thinking about how sport operates. And when we talk about sport today, we are talking about modern sport that developed in the 19th century. So when we're talking about sport now, we are talking about something that grew up in a particular moment in time and that is refined and evolved in a slightly different way since then. So it tells us a lot about 19th century Britain and Western Europe in particular, because it's rooted in colonialism and empire, not unlike ancient Rome. But it also shows how things have changed over time. So we can start to compare and contrast and tell that story. So what is sport? Why do we want to study sport? Why is it important? George Orwell, a British writer, more famous for novels like 1984 and Animal Farm, said that serious sport has nothing to do with fair play. It is wrapped up with hatred, jealousy, boastfulness, disregard of all rules, and sadistic pleasure in witnessing violence. In other words, it is war minus the shooting. So for Orwell, it was purely about nationalism. It was about two teams. So this was particularly England playing Hungary, just in the 1950s, I think it was. And it was about basically nationalism, getting one over your international rivals, but it was about violence on the pitch as much as anything else. It was, but also violence off the pitch in terms of how the spectacle is presented and how it is utilised by those in power and those in politics. Now, that's one way of seeing it, and some people dislike football or sport, and you might know many people like it. And even within something like football, some people might like football but hate cricket, or they might love athletics but hate football. And there's a certain understanding, and we've got to reflect that nuance, is that sport is not some general thing that applies to everyone. It does impact people in a different way, and there are different sports. But then there's a slight contrast here. So this is a famous quote from a Liverpool manager back in the 70s. It says, "Some people believe that football is a matter of life or death. And I'm very disappointed with that attitude. I can assure you it is much, much more important than that." And I think that's one thing that we do need to understand when it comes to sport, and why it is important, and why it is used in a variety of ways, either by people wanting to express nationalism, or by utilising it in development projects around the world, as you'll be seeing within this course. It means something to people. Most of you will be doing sport courses. You've engaged with this programme, I'm hoping, because you like sport. And because of that, that means something to you. It is important to you. And as I said earlier, sport is one of those rare examples of something that happens across human history and across human cultures. So it gives meaning to people's life, to their daily life, to their years, to their how they see the world. And it is often used as a metaphor to explain different parts of their life. However, what I would say is it a matter of, is football more important than life and death? We are unfortunately doing this programme remotely. You're watching a recorded video, a recorded lecture of this, rather than me coming to Brighton and seeing me do this face-to-face. The reason for that is a global pandemic where many things have stopped. And this time last year, football was one of many sports that was slowly starting to stop, to close down, to be paused, depending on what league you're in. Some leagues haven't really restarted, so amateur leagues in particular, non-leagues in particular. But the Olympics was due to take place in Tokyo last year. That has been postponed to this year. The European Championships were also due to take place last year. They have been postponed to this year because of the issues around COVID. Many people, fans, are not going to be able to necessarily go to these games or to these tournaments. So we can argue that there are some things that life is more important than sport. Which brings to, I think, a very beautiful quote from Jorge Valdano, who was an Argentinian player in 1986 in the World Cup, but also then became a reporter and broadcaster in Spain. And he said, of all the things that don't matter, football is the most important. And I think that's something that it comes back to that point, that it does matter. And for lots of people, it does matter. And I'm not just talking about football here, but sport, whatever sport you do, it matters to you. It gives you a social life. It gives you a sense of purpose. It gives you potentially a sense of self identity and self confidence. One of the things that we one of the ways we may identify with other people is that I'm a tennis player or I play tennis. It tells people what we are and what we do. If you say that you're a football fan, it tells people something. It also tells us that that is something that is important to you. So it does matter. And one of the things that we could probably argue from the last 12 months of the pandemic is the lack of sport has actually affected people. I'm going to very much talk about football, and I apologise for that, but there is that sense of sociability, that sense that we can go and watch and be around, watch a sport, but be around people who are like us. So the German sociologist George Simmel talks about sociability, just being with people who are like you or who you like. It doesn't necessarily have to be for a purpose. It doesn't have to be because you're going to get something out of it. It could just be because you like hanging out with people, being in a space where people say hi to you. And that's a nice feeling, to know that you belong to something bigger than yourself. And I think one of the ways that we can really understand sport is, and particularly sociologically, is that regular activity. So one of the early founding fathers of sociology, Emil Durkheim, talking about religion, identified that there was a difference between, how did people identify with a group over and above themselves? And he did a study of indigenous people in Australia and recognizing the difference between the sort of nomadic hunter-gatherers who would go out, but periodically come together for sort of rituals, for sort of religious rituals. And so religion has been the sort of founding purpose of social groups. But of course, what it did was that within the rituals of their faith, they identified with themselves above themselves, which is as a group. This was often symbolized in a totemic image. It could have been a kangaroo or a fish or something. They didn't see themselves as kangaroos, but they identified with this clan, this tribe, this totem. But also what was really important was the emotion that was involved, because when people are singing and drinking and dancing, there is a collective emotional energy there that brings people together. And it contrasts with your maybe more mundane everyday life. And again, I'm going to use football as an example here, which is you go to work, you may have quite a mundane life, but when you go to football on a Saturday or Sunday, there's singing, there's dancing, drinking, meeting people who are like you. And there is this atmosphere, this emotion, this sense of belonging to a group that is not you, but is more than you. And often we identify with it. So we might say, oh, did you win at the weekend? Oh, no, we lost. Well, no, you didn't win because you weren't playing. But you identify with it. And this isn't just the same. Football is a particular situation with crowds, but this also operates within sporting clubs, where you will recognize people, you will take part in things, the joy of victory, the joy of improvement, the coming together and working together, and of competition can be a positive, both from a self-confidence point of view, but also from a sort of a collective sort of emotional energy point of view as well, that, oh, this is great, I feel good here. And that's something that has been sadly missing over the last year. And to sort of bring this to a slightly different perspective about how it can give meaning to people over and above themselves. So this is the great sort of Trinidadian thinker, C.L.R. James, who wrote a book called Beyond the Boundary about cricket. It's a history of cricket, but it's not really a history of cricket. It's about a history of the West Indies, because he's basically argues that you can't divorce cricket from the political climate that it sits within. And his quote here is, what do they know of cricket who only know only cricket know. What do you only know of something if you're only focused on this very one small activity like cricket? Actually, you need to know a much bigger picture. It says West Indians crowding to test bring with them the whole past history and future hopes of the islands. You contrast this with the British, who may have a much longer history with many more sort of national heroes that they draw upon. So he talks about Sir Francis Drake or Shakespeare or Nelson. So victories in war or in literature or just culture in general. But he contrasts this with the three W's. So three Barbadian cricketers, Frank Worrell, Walcott and Weeks, or Ram and Val, who are fast bowlers, destroying, wrecking English batting. These sporting events of like the West Indies cricketers beating England in the 1950s, he argued, helped to fill the gap in their consciousness and in their needs. And I think we need to situate this within a particular moment in history, because what was happening in the 1950s across the world is independence movements, post-colonial, anti-colonial struggles as former colonies of European empires in particular, but also North America we could potentially add, started to win independence. They started to fight back about their imperial overlords and started to challenge. And when you are a nation that is new, that doesn't have a history necessarily that you can draw on, what new activities can you do that create a sense of unity or a sense of pride or a sense of self-consciousness? And sport is one of those spaces. So in the 1950s for the West Indies, these West Indian islands at cricket, beating the English at cricket, was a metaphor both for beating England as an empire and winning independence from being a former colony, but it also creates a history. It also creates a sense of, well, these are our national heroes. These are the people that we look up to. So if you go to the West Indies, you will find that cricketers in particular are named, buildings and roundabouts and roads are named after them because they have put these countries on the map. And it's not just about the West Indies, it's other nations as well. They start looking for sporting triumph in one area to basically put themselves on the global map and to give themselves a sense of national identity. Croatia, for example, after the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s, the first organization that they went to for international recognition was not the United Nations, but it was FIFA. They wanted to be able to play football. And we can think of other nations and how they might be perceived around the world. And we can think about someone like Usain Bolt at in Jamaica, for example, and sprinting as a national sort of sense of identity. But equally, if we think of countries like Brazil, which might be seen as playing big football countries, or New Zealand and rugby union, for example, it gives people the sense that we are something beyond ourselves as a group. And I think to give this history of sport, to come back to that point that I made earlier, when we talk about sport now, we're talking about modern sport, and this is effectively a set of sports that were effectively codified in the 19th century. And I think what we've got to reiterate here, that they are coming from a particular moment in history that is around an imperial history, a colonial history, particularly from Western Europe, and in particular talking about Britain, but also France and Germany as well. Sort of the more European powerhouses of the 19th century. Now, when we talk about football, for example, there are variations. There's been football being played around the world, in China, in Italy. There's been folk football in England for years. And this is, under varying rules. They were played on religious festivals or days off. It could have been teams of 50, 100 players. They could use their hand. They could maybe get into fights. And what slowly started to happen in the 19th century is these folk games started to become codified. They become, what Norbert Elias and Eric Dunning might suggest is being civilizing. They're slowly civilizing, taking some of the barbarity and the violence out of games, particularly to contrast with what we saw with the gladiators earlier. But also potentially, we're starting to see how certain ruling powers, ruling classes, socioeconomic classes, were also utilizing sport as a way of controlling and managing and using it as a metaphor to say this is what it means to be a man. This is about being a gentleman. This is about being tough, physically tough, spiritually tough, psychologically tough, but also fair. And I think what we're going to see is just how much this idea of being a gentleman is part and parcel. This idea of masculinity is part and parcel of modern sport. And again, it's reflective of a certain image of Victorian English gentlemen who had money, who had the power and the opportunities to play when they wanted to. And slowly how it changed into more popular sports where people who didn't have money started to play, then wanted to get paid because they would lose their wages if they didn't. And more importantly, how sport evolved, this modern sport evolved at a time when Europe in particular was changing quite dramatically. So it was moving from more rural to more urban and industrial, from more agrarian sort of farming to industrial society. So you had migrations of people partly around the world, but also from moving from the countryside into the cities. And this is where sport as a political activity, as a social activity, sort of really starts to take hold. This idea that sport was used for something other than just a fun activity. Within Britain in particular, the unions had fought to get Saturday afternoons free. And moral leaders, the church, the politicians, and potentially the industrialists as well, also all sort of felt that what are these working class people going to do on a Saturday afternoon? They're going to go to the pub, they're going to go to the gin house and start drinking gin, or they're going to go gambling in the gambling dens. How do we get them away from those morally dubious activities? Well, sport was one of those activities. They could either be playing it or they could be watching it. And that's one of the reasons why football became an activity at 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, because it was free time. People weren't working, whereas in other countries, Italy, Spain, for example, football became more synonymous with a Sunday afternoon because it was the one day off that people had in the week. But what we start to see is that sport became an activity that was supposedly about building character, about getting you, morally superior. There is part of the grounding for this is something called muscular Christianity. This idea that it would build you into being a physically tough and spiritually tough person. It builds on this notion of, again, coming from ancient Rome, from ancient Greece, but it comes from the Latin. And if any of you have go running, there's a brand called ASICS, ASICS, and that comes from the Latin anima sana and corpora sana, which is a healthy body, a healthy mind and a healthy body. And this idea that playing sport would make you a socially, psychologically, mentally and physically tough person. and good person. But also underpinning this is a notion that, particularly for the upper classes, this was about leading to tough, physically tough, psychologically tough men who would go and rule empire. And that's one of the reasons why modern sport moved as it did. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a very brief history of football, because I think it gives you an indication of how sport has changed, and what we think of being distinct sports is actually something that has evolved. And again, utilizing this idea of history, then you start to see how things have changed in culture. So you may be aware that there's American football, there's Australian rules football, and then we have association football, football, soccer, but then we also have rugby union and rugby league. Now, those roots are all actually the same. Folk football games where you could be running, you could be kicking, you could be handling. But what we notice is that, well, why is American football and Australian rules football different? Well, part of the reason for this is that the migration of people to the cities in Britain in particular that occurred in the mid-19th century also occurred as emigration. So British people going to America, going to Australia, and they took their versions of folk football with them. But what happened is this was all before the codification of association football as we know it today from 1863. So what happened is that the type of running about, kicking, carrying the ball with your hands and how you threw it evolved in a slightly different way in America, becoming American football as we know it today, and evolved slightly differently in Australian rules football, becoming AFL as we know it today. But in 1863, you had a group of wealthy individuals who went to public school, who would then go to university, particularly Cambridge, and then playing their different versions of their games. And what they agreed is that they needed to have a consistent set of rules, or the laws of football. Now, the men who had went to rugby school said, no, you had to carry the ball, you had to be able to handle the ball, and also do something called hacking, which was about kicking the shins of your opponents. So they said, we're going to separate and we're going to do our own thing, hence why we got rugby union. Whereas all those who wanted to kick a ball and not handle it became association football, and it started to evolve in a slightly different way. Now, what in particular happened was you had the issue of class within the formation of football in Britain. So you had the Football Association that formed, that organises the laws of the game and administers a cup competition. But then in the late 19th century, you start to get works teams, working class people who are working in these new industries, playing football and wanting to get paid, because if they took time off work, they didn't get paid. So they wanted to get recompensed for their time. And there was an internal battle between those players who said, no, we want to get paid, and the FA, which tended to be more upper class players from public schools, the private schools in Britain, who wanted to keep it as an amateur, almost like money corrupted the game. And there's this internal fight, but then they sort of effectively agreed to have a league. So the Football League was set up, which allowed for regular competition, where teams played each other over a period of time, so in a league structure rather than a cup competition where people could get knocked out. And they admitted that people could get paid. Now, when rugby, who had broken away, had the same sort of battle, the rugby union said, no, we're not going to let our players get paid. And those that wanted to play, to get paid for playing, then separated out and created their own sport called rugby league, and again having a league structure. So you get a very slightly different evolution here. So we have groups of people who've moved to Australia and to America, forming, evolving in one way. In Britain, it evolves into football as we know, but then a separation of rugby union and a separation of rugby league. And of course, this is the height of the British Empire. So Britain has invaded a quarter of the globe and is administering it, but equally it's also a global trading power. So sailors, army people, administrators around the globe will start to play football. And this then gets picked up by different groups. So, picked up in Europe, picked up in Latin America, in Africa, etc. And of course, there's other sports that have gone, particularly associated with the British Empire. So cricket's being played in the West Indies, in South Asia, in Australia and New Zealand, and the same with rugby being played in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, etc. So you can sort of see how empire, colonialism helps spread this, but it's also rooted in the way that this sport and these activities were seen as a way of building character. It was about building being a strong gentleman, sense of fair play, but also sense of superiority to others. Now, obviously, this is very Britain focused at the moment. There was a separate movement taking place elsewhere, namely Baron de Coubertin in France, who again wanted to have competition without war, particularly after France had lost to the Prussians in the 19th century, and had this idea of bringing back the Olympic Games that had been played in ancient Greece 2,500 years ago. So he introduced maybe what would be considered more European sports into the Olympic Games. So particularly bringing in gymnastics to make sure that the Germans would want to be involved, because that was sort of the more national sport in Germany at the time. But it was running, it was jumping, but also bringing in other types of sports that were potentially fashionable at the time. So archery, cycling, rowing, etc. The sort of games, sort of sports that are associated with those with wealth and with money. And again, rooted in this sense of masculinity, of men, this is what men do, and this is what men with money do. So you can sort of see how a lot of the groundwork for how we see sport has changed, but also it's rooted in a certain worldview at the time, which is of white, middle class, upper class men and how they see the world. And what we've effectively been challenging ever since is those views. So to suggest that sport is not political, as some politicians will say, and of course nothing says something's not political than a politician saying it, is sport has always been used for politics. It may have been for presenting the world view of those in power, and it still does, but it's also a space where people have challenged things. And I think, as we move through to the World Cup and how we can compare and contrast that, I'm going to ask you now just to take a short break and watch a couple of videos. So again, back to YouTube. And what I'd like you to do is first watch this short clip. Apologies for the anyone for the Germans who may be watching this, but this is a short clip of the 1966 World Cup final. And again, what I'd like you to do is just watch this. It's a game of course, spot the difference. So watch this clip, and then, so again, if you Google or put in YouTube 1966 World Cup final, this is on FIFA TV. So you should be able to find it, and then immediately go and watch the next one, which is the 2018 World Cup final. Also a 4-2, this time France against Croatia, also on FIFA TV. Compare and contrast, they're 2 minutes each. They're both highlights of the games. And what I'd like you to do is just have a watch, compare, contrast. What are they? Just 60 years apart. And we can see potentially how football has changed at this level. So So pause the lecture and then watch these, and then I'll come back to it. Okay, thanks very much for doing that. So what I'd like you to do, I mean, obviously you've had some time to reflect and to think about this. And I'm going to go through some of the bigger changes that you might notice. One is the type of spectacle that it is, both from how the teams come out, how the cup is presented, how the cup is presented to the winners at the end. You know, just with this clip here, you can sort of see, you know, the confetti, the spectacle. You can see the joy in the players. It's on a stage that is brought onto the pitch rather than just sort of presented by the Queen for England in 1966. So there's an increase in spectacle. Now that spectacle has increased because we now have television. Back in 1966, not every household had televisions. Often it would be people coming into one person's house who might have had a television. It might be in bars, whereas by the 1970s, 80s, houses, every house started to have a television. Whereas so it becomes, that's mainly about Europe, North America. But now we're starting to see how that's sort of spreading around the world, and because of television, there's more interest. It's television itself has evolved, so you almost see the camera angles and how the audience is filmed, how the players are filmed. I think what we can see from the more recent World Cup is the emotion on the players, partly because the cameras are better, they can zoom in and you can see the joy or the despair on the players themselves, or even the managers when they cut to the dugouts. But also to the audience and the crowds. And what you might notice is that, thinking about who actually might have attended the World Cup in '66, mainly white men, mainly almost all from Britain or England, probably all from the southeast and London. It wasn't seen as a big event in the same way that it is now, where people, in this case, Croatia and France in the final, had Croatians and French fans in the stadium who had travelled to Moscow for the final. So you had a much different, the audience itself is made up in a very different way. The players are also demographically different because migration from former colonies in since the Second World War has also changed the demographics of nations somewhat. Not to say that there hasn't always been a migration of people associated with these empire and colonies before that, but we're now seeing that maybe they're more accepted within football, within sport, and demographically you see a very much more diverse set of players. Yet, we should also recognise that there's still exclusions. For example, in Britain, exclusion of British Asian players, for example. We can see these systematic exclusions that emerge, even though they might like football. But we can see these subtle changes that have taken place over the last 60 years. Hopefully what you might have noticed as well is looking around the stadium, there might not have been any, there wasn't any advertising hoardings in 1966, where there were certain ones that were very prominent in the last World Cup and in every World Cup and in the Champions League and in the Olympics. And I'll come on to that now, because this is part and parcel of how modern sport has developed in the last 40 years. So what we're talking about here is how sport has now moved from being this idea of an amateur game where there was fighting, resistance for getting people to be paid, that suddenly it's now become a globally lucrative business that is a media spectacle. It is something that has the biggest multinationals associated with it. And this in turn helps to put money into clubs, who then buy the best players, have the best coaches, and the best sort of sports science and support with them. But then this also challenges how we might see things, and how sport is run, and potentially how the impact that has away from the elite game onto communities in different ways. And I think we can see that with COVID. As less money is being put into grassroots sports, does that have more of an impact on communities? So these two people here is, on the left is Sepp Blatter, a former president of FIFA, and João Havelange, of who was the FIFA president before Sepp Blatter. So Sepp Blatter became FIFA president in 1998, when France won the World Cup before. Havelange was 1974. And how he came to power is quite important, because he was from Brazil. He competed in the Olympics as a swimmer, as a water polo player. But he also understood what it was like to be a colonized nation. Brazil being a former colony of Portugal. And up until 1974, the president of FIFA was someone called Sir Stanley Rouse, an Englishman, who, let's say with sort of traditional English arrogance, assumed that people would vote for him, particularly the new colonies that had emerged in the 1940s and 50s, 1950s and 60s rather. And as I say, we're seeing similar trends emerge through sport, and how what was formed in an imperial in colonies, in industrial setting, has evolved and changed to a global, maybe more de-industrialized setting, more media focused, services focused, but also still about rooted in those senses of injustice from the past, and how to win power potentially through sport. Now, what João Havelange, the guy on the right, recognised is that to win power at FIFA, every country has one vote. So Russia has one vote, Malta has one vote. Okay, it's the way that it's set up, and he also recognised that in the 1960s and 50s, 60s, those new ex-colonies became new nations. And they also were looking for a space on the world stage. And particularly through football, it gave them an opportunity to be on the world stage. If you go and have a look at like Wikipedia pages of World Cups, you'll see that invariably, and it's still there to a certain extent, is the majority of teams come from Europe and then Latin America. And slowly over the last 40 years, there's been an increase of teams from Africa and Asia. In particular, that's given them a space to play on the world stage. And the suggestion being that the next World Cup will have more teams, again, to bring more people in. But that also means more money, because there's more television audiences, more people interested, more television space, which means sponsors have more opportunity to sell their goods, which means more money comes in. So we can see how the focus in the last 40 years has become about money. But most importantly is Havelange went around the world to these new nations to say, okay, I will increase the World Cup to give you more of an opportunity to get into the World Cup. But most importantly as well, what he did was he needed to finance this. And what he did with someone called Horst Dassler, who was a German businessman. And I'm going to tell you a little story about Horst Dassler and then come back to João Havelange and his relationship there. Because Horst Dassler was the son of someone called Adi Dassler. Now, most of you will have heard of Adidas. The ball in the picture is Adidas. Adolf Dassler, Adi Dassler, shortened becomes Adidas. And he was a running athletics footwear manufacturer in the 1920s and 30s. But what he did is he recognized that he needed to do something different to make his shoes more successful and to sell more shoes. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Obviously, you can't answer, but I'm sure you're going to know the answer. What is distinctive about Adidas as a brand, Adidas shoes? And I'm hoping you've all gone 3 stripes. So when you see someone wearing 3 stripes on their shoes, you know that they are wearing Adidas. You don't even need to see Adidas. And that's what Adidas had worked out in the 20s and 30s, which was all shoes had to have pieces of leather to keep them in place so that they wouldn't fall apart. And he basically patented the idea that you would have 3 stripes and that no one else could use that. But what it meant is that when athletes were wearing Adidas and they were winning, then other athletes would see them and go, oh, we should buy those shoes. So he became a pioneer of branding in that sense. But he was also very clever at giving freebies, free shoes to those successful athletes. Remembering that at the time, athletics was an amateur sport, so they shouldn't take money, so they weren't able to get paid, but they were given free shoes, which then became a free commercial when other people saw those types of shoes. Now, the interesting thing about Adidas was the rival that he had with his brother called Rudolf Dassler, or Rudi Dassler, who set up a rival company called Puma. And again, Puma did something quite similar. They have a very distinct side to their shoes. So that sibling rivalry drove particular competitive balance between the 2 shoe manufacturers, who were both based in a small village in the far west of West Germany. Now, Adi Dassler's son was someone called Horst Dassler. He wanted to branch out on his own and effectively was given control of Adidas France. He also set up Le Coq Sportif and Arena as separate sports brands. And he also recognized that, okay, if you're going to start selling more products, you need to think about sport marketing in a very different way. So he went to, he was a networker. He started building a relationship with Havelange before he became president of FIFA, and started to say, what you should do is restrict the number of sponsors that you have for your competition. This will increase the price, which means more money comes into FIFA. He worked with his business partner, Patrick Nally, to try to get Pepsi or Coca-Cola to be the soft drink manufacturer of choice for the FIFA World Cup. The idea being that they get the exclusive rights to the World Cup and therefore can all the advertising that goes with this world competition, global competition. Pepsi never got back to him, but Coca-Cola did. And effectively what it did was say, okay, we've got the biggest brand in the world on our side. And what they started to do was to identify key sponsors that would get the exclusive rights for the sporting competition. So Horst Dassler being obviously associated with Adidas meant that Adidas got the official sportswear and football sponsorship. And I'll show you something in a minute that will sort of reiterate that. And recognizing that we could build recruit certain companies. They had to be global in reach, so they couldn't just be based in one country. They had to be international in reach, so they would be able to appeal to a bigger market, but they would also have more money that they would wish to invest in this. So what slowly starts to happen since 1974 is a smaller, tighter knit group of official sponsors, or corporate partners as they're now called, which pay more for the opportunity to sponsor with a competition or a tournament, which gives more money to the international governing body. So what we see at a World Cup, for example, is those small numbers of sponsors, and I'll show you what the ones that for the Olympics are in a minute. But also what Horst Dassler did with FIFA was to go, right, television's becoming a more important medium. Up until this point, sport was almost seen as a news story. It was something that was current affairs, therefore it wasn't seen as entertainment. But what Horst Dassler did with Joe Havilange was to reduce, to again say, restrict access to the competition, and therefore media packages, and then sell it as a separate media package, as an entertainment package. And in this way, it pushes the price up and restricts access. So in America, for example, ABC, NBC are different television channels, and they would compete for access to showing the World Cup or for showing the Olympics, which increases the value of the media package. Horst Dassler, I should also say, set up an organisation called Independent International Sport and Leisure, which effectively bought the rights off FIFA and then sold them to his own company, sold them. So there's a whole other story about the relationship Horst Dassler had, and how that money was made and went, which has links into more recent news that has access to Sepp Blatter and allegations of corruption within FIFA, and how money starts to change hands. But I think we will move away from that just now. But even through something as simple as a World Cup football, we can sort of see how things have changed. And what you can see from 1974 is that Adidas balls become the norm. Coincidentally, 1974 is when Joe Havilange became president of FIFA. But also what we've seen each year is that there is a dedicated ball, which is specifically manufactured for that competition. It becomes new technology, it becomes new branding, it becomes identified with the World Cup. So what we see is that this competition becomes a global moment, a global spectacle, and everything down to the football helps create that spectacle. And also to reiterate that this isn't just about football, this is also about the Olympics, but also most other competitions and activities and clubs. So what you start to see is that each club, each competition has a dedicated set of corporate partners. And this is the Olympic Partner Programme for Tokyo this year. And what you'll notice is that they come from very particular subsets of industry. So Airbnb, so obviously home letting, vacation activity. It's not competing with other ones in the same sense. You've got Intel, you've got Bridgestone tires, you've not got Dunlop and other, or Continental there as well. Toyota is the official car manufacturer, so you're not seeing Nissan or Hyundai or Ford because they don't want to compete. And if you have them, then it dilutes the amount of money coming in. And that's the idea, is you have dedicated sections that don't compete, that increase the value of the product. And of course, these have particular associations with with the Olympics, but then if you're a Manchester United fan, they'll have their own particular corporate partners, as will most other competitions as well. So what we've got is I've told you a very brief story about how sport means things to people. It means things in different ways. It's moved on from being used as a vehicle for white middle class, upper class gentlemen in Western Europe to being, sort of identifying how men should be and how men should rule the world in some senses, literally and metaphorically. How it shifted from being this idea of amateur and now moving into something much more global and corporate. So how it's globalized in that sense and become much more corporate. But it still means things in different ways. It's still politicizing in different ways. So the governing bodies that are operating, they're changing how the sport is run, how it's presented, and the values that are associated with it. And often we start to go back to those values of Victorian or 19th century sport, but equally they change and they adapt and they're used in different ways, and we'll come to that later. But fans also have become more politicized and more active, and rather than just becoming, rather than just being people who turn up at a game to watch a game or to watch an event, in some cases like the Olympics, people do, particularly within football, they become invested in the team. They become invested in that activity. As I said earlier, it means something when, whether you're a member of a swimming club or a cycling club or a football club, it means something to you. It gives you a sense of belonging. Now, what's interesting about football fans in particular is it's the fans that are doing these things, not necessarily the participants. But they have become more political, partly in relation to these economic changes that have taken place since the 1980s, particularly in football. Premier League in 1992, the Champions League in 1992, but equally we've seen similar movements where the Bundesliga, Liga 1, Serie A have all gone through very similar processes, which have been about increasing commercialization, about more international competition. There's a debate now about a European Super League, and fans have resisted that and challenged that, or some fans have. And there's a movement around no to modern football, no to this commercialism, and resistance movements associated with that. But equally, fans have also stepped up and, in some cases, have been exhibiting racism, sexism, homophobia in the game. But equally, they've also stepped up to challenge some of those activities. So we see that sport isn't just something that you turn up and watch. It means something in lots of different ways. And what we're now seeing, and I would argue in my work, is that sport becomes an important activity. It becomes a social movement in its own right. It becomes people using their platform, their collective activity, their regular collective activity to mobilize, to operate in different ways. So ultras is a certain style of fandom around Europe, but often there was floods or earthquakes in Italy, for example, and football fans, the ultras, would come out to help, utilizing their networks, their social relationships, to come out and help with the clear up, or to raise money for the victims. So we're seeing people utilizing sport to mobilize for their communities in different ways. So the value of sport, and why study sport, is because it does give meaning to people, and those people are then acting in socially, in community ways, socially or political ways, which becomes quite important as a vehicle, because historically what social movements have been about is about either winning workers' rights or rights to vote, particularly around gender rights or civil rights around race and racism. But now we're seeing people mobilize around their activity, their leisure activity, mobilizing to campaign around reducing ticket prices or stopping their club from rebuilding a stadium. So they're mobilizing in different ways, which means something, and that's something very important. So how sport is used depends on the people that are using it and what they do and how they see the sport and what they should be doing with it. And to reiterate, because we're living in a particular moment, I think, where these issues are sort of highlighted, particularly after the Black Lives Matter movement re-emerged last year after the killing of George Floyd, is that these histories and sport becomes these histories of people wanting to fight for their political rights or for their freedom of expression. Sport becomes a space where it creates a global moment, a global spectacle where those individuals can make their points. This is from 1968. This is Tommy Smith in the middle and John Carlos on the right there. Peter Norman, the Australian, on the left. And this Black Power salute was part of a coordinated campaign led by sports sociologist Harry Edwards, to campaign around to use sport as a vehicle to fight for civil rights and civil rights recognition in the US. At the same time, Muhammad Ali was very political and was banned from boxing because he refused to fight in the Vietnam War. So one of their requirements was to get Ali reinstated as a boxer to get his permit back. But it was also about just highlighting the fact that there were few or no African-American coaches in athletics. So they're recognizing the structural issues within sports there. But it was also about highlighting and reiterating the marginalization and the political marginalization of African Americans in America. And what's interesting and important about this is that following from Black Lives Matter last year, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, has said they will not permit political acts in the Olympics. Now, it's interesting, and taking a critical view of this is, as we've seen already, sport is a space of nationalism. It is a space of commercialism, of capitalism, and those are permitted within the Olympics because that is what the Olympics is built on. It's built on a sense of nationalism and national competition. It's built on those corporate brands to make them money. Those are also political statements that are permitted within the IOC. And what they don't want to see is things that challenge those views or that way of being. And one of the reasons why it's so important, I think, to think about the role of athletes within this is because sport has presented a certain way of thinking since the 19th century, which is a group of white middle-class men and the values that they espouse. And slowly over time, through working class people fighting to get paid to play, to African Americans in particular, as Tommy Smith and John Carlos showed, using it as a space to fight for particular rights, both within the sport and outside of the sport. So why sport? What's the value of sport? It provides a platform that communicates to people across cultures in a way that other activities may not do. Colin Kaepernick is inspired taking the knee. He was a quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers and decided to take a knee during the national anthem at NFL American football games, and almost as if to prove his point, he was then, when his contract expired, no one signed him because he was seen as a troublemaker, because he resisted the idea that black men should be killed by the police in America. But then he was seen as disrespecting the flag and the anthem. And again, when we talk about no politics in sport, why is there a national anthem at an American football game, for example? It's nationalism being incorporated. There's a sense of politics there. But he was seen as a different type of politics, which was unacceptable. But what he did is he utilized his space. And interestingly, Nike, as a sportswear brand, has utilized this image and utilized this rebelliousness to sort of try to present itself. And again, it's still a massive corporation. It still makes lots of money, but it is also then seeing itself as a way of bringing in a critical voice or a challenging voice. But I wonder how many of these athletes or how many employees within Nike, for example, are speaking up and trying to change things within their supply chains, and maybe association with exploitative labor in the global south, for example. These things don't necessarily get brought up. So there's, again, utilizing sport for a particular opportunity. And again, I'm going to come back to Britain, but last year, Marcus Rashford, who plays for Manchester United in England, started a campaign for the government to keep paying for school meals for poorer children in Britain. It's because of lockdown, because he argued that there were so many children living in poverty in Britain that the meal that they had at school was the only meal they potentially had in a day, and therefore it was important to keep it going. And he was very, very successful. But again, what we see here is not someone doing something for their sports or for their rights to play a sport or to take part in a sport. This was utilizing their platform to sell something or to do something more than their sport. Using sport as a vehicle to bring about his own personal struggles, but to have a higher purpose than just playing sport. So again, coming back to what's the value of sport, is it means something to people. It gives people a platform too, and it gives them an opportunity to speak out in different ways. Now, very deliberately, you might have noticed that the images and most of what's been discussed has been about men. And what are things I would reiterate is that sport is gendered. It is one of the few activities that is done separately. So if you do physical education at schools, you'll be separated by gender, which you're not done within maths or physics or geography. And competition is still divided on gender. And again, it comes back to those roots of sport, that 19th century idea that sport was for men, for upper class men who could afford to play, to pay. They didn't have to pay. They had the resources that they could take part. It was a sense of this is what the values of society should be for these gentlemen, about fair play, but about being physically tough. It was seen as something that women should not do. Pierre de Coubertin, the founder of the modern Olympics, was very explicit that this was not, that women should not take part in sport. The idea being that it would, he utilized the image of ancient Greece, where women weren't allowed to take part or even to watch sport in ancient Greece. But it was also very much rooted in this idea that women should stay at home, women are too fragile, and sport was too physical and tough for women. But and this continued, and again, giving an example of football in England, during the First World War, women's football was very, very popular, partly because the men were fighting in Europe, but also women were playing football, and you get big crowds. One particular team called the Dick Kerr Ladies was very popular. But it was so popular that the FA saw that it was a problem, and in 1921 banned women's football for 50 years. They wasn't allowed to play football on FA pitches or FA clubs until 1971. So again, when people start saying, "Oh, women's football is different from men's football," let's try banning men's football for 50 years and see how good men are in 50 years' time. So what we start to see is that, again, the power dynamics of football, the power dynamics of sport started to exclude groups and people, be they working class, be they women, or be they non-white groups of people. But what we can also see through sport is that these spaces become, again, as CLR James argued, this idea that people can put themselves forward. They can challenge those people in power. They can fight for their right to play or to be heard or to be seen. And in particular, we're seeing this in a variety of ways. Serena Williams is a similar type of character as Megan Rapinoe, number 15 there at the front, who are utilising their prestige, their celebrity to make public comments, to make political comments. Serena Williams is the most successful tennis player ever, and yet, particularly in Britain, for example, when journalists in particular start talking about the most successful tennis player, they're always referring to men. And this is part and parcel of the roots of sport being a male space, where notions of masculinity are produced, the values and ideas are produced, and within this space, people are challenging that in a variety of ways. But we still have the World Cup and the Women's World Cup. And it's the Premier League and the Women's Super League. They have to put women in front of something as opposed to it being gender neutral. The default is always that sport is male, and that comes back from the 19th century. And slowly, women have fought for their right to play and to be paid equally in some cases, and to fight for that space. So what we can see through this story, and just thinking about it sociologically and utilizing history, is how sport is a space where things can change, things can be challenged, it can present certain dominant values. It can be dominant values of nationalism, of capitalism, of masculinity potentially. But it also can be a space where people can challenge it. And I'm going to finish now with a quote that you're going to see a lot of, if you're particularly in the sport for development and peace sector. And I'm going to be critical of this, this quote. But Nelson Mandela said that sport has the power to change the world. It has the power to inspire, has the power to unite people in a way that little else does. It speaks to youth in a language they understand. Sport can create hope where once there was only despair. It is more powerful than government in breaking down racial barriers. Now, what I hope I've shown you through this particular lecture, very briefly, is that sport is a contested space. It does have the power to inspire. It does have the power to change things and breaking down some barriers and to create hope. It does mean things for people. And I've shown you various people who have challenged things and even countries that, utilize their space to sort of give themselves a sense of purpose, be it the West Indies or Croatia, for example. And, people who they might, feel as more powerful than them, particularly if they're formerly a colonized people. But it also has the power to reinforce certain worldviews, be it gender, be it race, be it class, be it nationalism, be it capitalism, for example. A certain way of seeing the world is this way and this way only. And what we can see is that some people are using it to challenge people. They're using it to assert themselves. They're using it as a platform to change the world. And, potentially it does have that power. But equally, whenever a politician says, it can bring people together, also remember that it divides. Sport is inherently a paradox. It brings people together. It's bringing us together in this activity. People from around the world, 3 different universities with 5 different NGOs doing different activities with different people. It brings people together. It's bringing us together. But it also divides us because it divides us into winners and losers. It divides us into rival countries or rival teams. And what we have to do is work together to overcome that and utilize that important activity, the collective emotional energy, as Emil Durkheim might say, of bringing people together, for that sociability of people, like George Simmel said, of working together, of doing things together, being with people that you like to be with, of breaking down those barriers and saying that we are all fans of this particular sport or this particular activity. And that takes work and that takes effort. just by putting people in the same space doesn't mean that it automatically breaks down barriers. Women have had to fight for their space within sport. It wasn't just by them doing it that they suddenly broke those barriers, disappeared. They fought for it. Likewise with racism and breaking down racial barriers. There is racism in football. In Britain at the moment, every weekend there is a news story about racism being shared on social media or directed at black and brown players within English football. It divides people. Within football, there is hooliganism. It divides people. It doesn't automatically bring people together. So it requires work. It requires effort. It requires maybe a different way of thinking about it. And this is where I'm going to lead into and use this as the sort of stepping stone for the other activities that we do within this program. Because what it does is it's going to say, right, okay, there might be different ways we do think about doing sport. Do we do them playing the existing rules in the existing way? Or do we come up with different ways of playing football? So our colleagues, Football for Peace, Football for Peace, Hope and Unity, MSIS and NX use football to bring people together in different ways, maybe celebrate different parts of the game and how they work. Same with Play Handball, using a different sport. It's not necessarily always doing and playing the sport in itself, but it's how the sport or the activity is used. And that requires work. And that's really where the program is going to be for the next 4 weeks, is what work's required. How do we do that work? How do those NGOs, our project partners, do things on the ground practically that break down some of these barriers? Because just by doing it doesn't break that barrier. The coaches, the project partners that are using sport, they work really hard to do that. They're building those relationships between the participants, between the people playing. And to a certain extent, this is what this program is going to be about, is how do we, as a group of people in different countries around the world, 3 different universities, how do we get to know each other? How do we work together? And what we're going to see is just by sticking you on a Zoom call together isn't going to work. It's not going to suddenly make you feel that you have a connection to someone in a different country. But we have activities that are there to bring you together, to get you to know each other, team building activities, get to know you activities. And this is what happens within Sport for Development projects. It's about breaking down those barriers by getting to know you as human beings, as fellow human beings, and then working hard, the coaches and the volunteers, to build those relationships. So hopefully this is quite a long lecture, but it sort of hopefully gives you a grounding of how to think about sport in a slightly different way. To be critical, to not just assume that sport is this amazing activity that suddenly brings people together, that it's not beset with problems, but also potentially to give you some hope that, okay, there's ways that it can be changed, because history tells us it's changed. The way sport is played now is very different than how it's played 60 years ago, as the video with 1966 shows. It's very different than how it was played in the 19th century, and it's very different from how it was played in ancient Rome. So we can see that it's changed. So it gives us hope that we can do something differently. And with that, I will finish the lecture.